Desiree Stage is an award-winning artist. She's a mom and a suicidologist. She created Live Through This, a multimedia storytelling series that aims to reduce prejudice and discrimination against suicide attempt survivors. Live Through This reminds us that suicide is a human issue. It does so by elevating and amplifying survivors' voices through raw, honest stories of survival and pairing them with portraits. Live Through This has received media coverage from New York Times, NPR, CNN, Vice News, CBS Evening News, and more. Desiree produces and co-hosts the video podcast Suicide and Stuff with her co-host, Jess Stolman-Rainey. She also created the Suicide Media Bot, a bot on Twitter that tweets about suicide-safe messaging, and she maintains I Hurt Myself, a self-injury resource built by people with lived experience of non-suicidal self-injury for people with lived experience of non-suicidal self-injury. We welcome you, Desiree. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And we're just gonna unmute her real quick.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
All right. Now let's see if I can share my screen the right way. Okay, I got it. Thank you for having me, everybody. All right, let's see. So, hi, I'm Des. I want to open up by acknowledging that the land I'm presenting from is part of the traditional unceded territory of the Lenape people. The Lenape are one of the oldest tribes in the northeastern United States. They had a reputation for being a peace-loving community, known for being diplomats. They were hospitable toward the first colonizers, but eventually they were threatened, murdered, forcibly removed from their lands and pushed west. The majority of the Lenape now live in Oklahoma, though there are still 13,000 Philadelphians who identify as Native American, including the Lenape, Cherokee, Creek, and Cree. So this is me, looking moody. I'm 37 years old and cranky, mostly. Those I think are my best identifiers. I'm a photographer, a writer, an MSW student now. That's my newest thing. Suicidologist. I'm originally from Miami. I've lived a ton of places, all over Florida, Tennessee for a few years, New York for nearly a decade before I landed in Philly. And I think Philly is home now. I am a daughter to my mom on my wedding weekend. I am a sibling. I don't know if I believe in soulmates, but if they're real, I'm almost positive I found and married mine. She's pretty great. Her name is Phil. I like tattoos, beer, bourbon, documentaries, true crime, memoirs, podcasts about these things. I'm a huge music fan. I love everything from Tori Amos, Taylor Swift to Dolly Parton. Everything. I'm a mom, as we mentioned, to two amazing, infuriating, hilarious babies who are exactly 15 months apart. This is Gus, and this is Theo. I carried Theo, and my wife carried Gus, and that's all of us, and we're very cute together. My life is amazing. It is everything I could have ever wished for, and far, far, far beyond. But there's other stuff, too. Suicide has been a part of my life since I was a kid. And like anything else, or maybe more than anything else, I think suicide is complicated. I've seen it from more angles than I'd care to, which compelled me to dedicate my life to changing it when I first experienced it, and has subsequently compelled me to rededicate over and over again. So I think this is probably a good time to introduce you to the project, and I've got a video for that. All right.
Live Through This is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the United States. So the catalyst for starting the project was personal experiences I had with depression, with self-injury, with my own suicide attempt, and I also lost friends to suicide. And I noticed that we don't talk openly about our personal experiences with suicide and with suicidal thoughts and suicidal feelings. And I just wanted to change that.
Live Through This is important because it's important for people to see that there's hope after an attempt and that there's people out there like them and they're not alone. Not feeling alone is a big deal as a human being.
If people don't understand it, this might give them a chance to see, like, you know, there's a human here. You know, it is something I think that a lot of people maybe deal with at some point in time, and it's nice to just have some solidarity there for them and with them, you know.
A lot of suicide attempt survivors have never told the story from front to back because they've never been encouraged to. So I give them that space. And afterwards, I make a portrait.
To see people's souls within their eyes, it was amazing. To be able to create that bond that you're not alone, it could help so many others.
I've seen suicide from so many different angles, and so I understand it from an academic perspective. But more importantly, I understand it from lived experience, from a very personal perspective. So when I sit down with somebody and they tell me their story, they know that they're sitting with somebody who's been there too.
When I found the project, I thought, wow, fantastic. You know, this is a way for me to talk without somebody giving me a really strange look or trying to give me medication or trying to lock me up or telling me how wrong I was about something.
And to be able to have a conversation with someone else who's experienced that, you know you're not going to be judged, and to be able to open up and be honest about that experience. I felt like I was like being heard with every single word.
I want people to come away understanding suicide better or wanting to understand it better. I want them to be more open to talking about it because one thing we know is that asking about suicide saves lives.
And we just need to reach out and say, we can talk about it, we can approach it, it does happen, and the more we're scared of it, the more difficult it can be for people who face it because they know they have nowhere to go. And that feeling of having nowhere to go and no one to speak with kind of makes it worse in the first place.
It connects us to our stories, not only for the stories that we're reading of other attempt survivors, but the stories that are untold within ourselves. And it gives us hope and an opportunity to know that recovery is possible.
The story's ready to be told to everybody. Get it out there. Let people see that I'm a regular human being.
When I listen to the stories of suicide attempt survivors like me, I don't hear weakness. I don't hear selfishness. I hear courage. I hear compassion. I hear resilience. I hear survival. I hear life. You know, this project is not about death. This project is about life. That's why I called it Live Through This.
The people who are on that brink, they say, like, listen, like, there's a whole nother side to this. There is so much love in the world still. So, like, soldier on, man. You know what I mean?
Right. Joey still gives me the shivers several years after we filmed that interview with him. Also, the singer of that song lives in your state, y'all. Charlotte Martin. You should look her up. It is important to me that we center the voices of lived experience in order not only to create community and peer support, but to flesh out the complexity and explore the nuances of suicide beyond being suicidal. I've had few experiences in my life that felt lonely, truly isolating. Okay, this is doing what I thought it would. One of those experiences is losing a parent or foundational figure. We lost my grandfather in April. And for all intents and purposes, he was my father figure. He raised me. It's the same with my babies. Hold on, I'm getting it back, bringing it back. So we didn't get to grieve the way that that we should have, and that kind of loss of losing a part of who you are, a part of your history, of the possibility that there are questions about you or your family that can now never be answered, memories that they took with them. it is an experience that cannot be known without being felt. And I think suicide is the same way. Even if we knew everything there is to know about suicide, and we do not, there is a certain quality to the feeling, the lived experience that informs and completes that knowing. I don't think we can have one without the other. Based on my work and my studies over the past decade, I really firmly believe that suicide is something that can happen to anyone. So to me, that knowing is imperative to making change. So I'm gonna tell you my story and weave the work in, and we're gonna go from there. The first time I experienced suicide, it was the butcher at Winn-Dixie. He was a co-worker of my grandmother's. Was 2 or 3, according to my mom. I still remember that. I loved him. My grandmother talked about his wife, about his daughter that he left behind, how he was found, how he did it, and what a shame it was. And that was it. My computer is not cooperating. Then something's happening here. Hold on. Okay. All right. The transition from middle school to high school was really hard on me. I stopped sleeping at night, started sleeping in class. I started failing classes, which I'd never done before. I managed to fail marching band once. I don't know how. My relationships with my parents suddenly felt impossible to navigate. My friends were all dating, and I was questioning my sexuality, and I was so lonely. I experienced depression for the first time. I had suicidal thoughts for the first time. I started hurting myself to feel better. And when I was in 10th grade, the slide that I advanced a little early, this is Brian. When I was 15 and he was 16, Brian died by suicide. It sent me into this spiral of grief. And my grandmother would ask me, why do you care so much? Why is this affecting you this much? She said Brian was an idiot and that he was selfish. And it seemed obvious to me. I cared because I'd lost my friend who felt alone and who was in pain and who didn't know how to ask for help, or he didn't feel he could ask for help. And I was feeling all of those things too. I didn't think that I could ask for help because I was just a kid, and whatever I was feeling couldn't compare to the adult problems that I saw around me, the gambling and the substance use and the cops at 2 a.m. and the 72-hour holds in psych wards. What I was feeling couldn't compare. How could it? So something very strange is happening where this toolbar just keeps going up and down. Anyway, me as a teenager, it's awkward. From the perspective of this 37-year-old sitting here today, I don't think we give enough credence to the complex inner lives of teenagers. Every feeling is amped up. Everything feels so big and so hard and so lonely because it's the first time. I think we forget that as we get older. We invalidate young people when they need more support than almost anyone. I attempted suicide for the first time in the summer of 2000. Probably around the time, the picture on the right, oh my God, the beeper, okay. I forgot about the beeper. I was 17, I was in the middle of one of many breakups with my first love. And it was also around the time that we were outed against our will. And my girlfriend's mom threatened to kill me when she found out that we were together. I have no recollection of this suicide attempt. I didn't mention the S word expressly in the journal where I found this note. But what I did describe was pretty clearly a suicide attempt. I moved to Orlando in the fall of 2001 for college, but as before, I just didn't handle this transition well. To be fair, we all know what happened that fall. 9/11 is like JFK for some of us, we remember. For me, it was a bright blue sky Tuesday morning, and I had just failed my first college chemistry test. I heard the news, and I just thought the world was ending. I had nightmares for weeks. I was homesick. I kept calling my parents and crying and crying. Still wasn't sleeping, still hurting myself. I think I failed every class but one that semester. And that's the time my family decided that it was time for me to see someone. So when I went home for winter break, they took me to our family doctor, and oh wait, we're not there yet. Whatever. he said, "Are you sad a lot? Do you cry a lot? Are you sleeping more than usual? Are you sleeping less than usual? Have you gained a lot of weight or lost a lot of weight?" And I answered the questions, and he gave me a prescription for an antidepressant. No further conversation. Depression was my first diagnosis. The next spring of 2002, things got worse, and that was the impetus for me to seek therapy for the first time. I come from hard workers who keep their heads down and live their lives privately. Therapy was not a thing that we did in my family. I don't think it was not a thing that we did so much as it just really never entered into the equation as an option. You know, like if ignoring your problems and thinking positively wasn't working, there was a pill for that. And those were the things that could handle your problems. So seeking therapy just didn't come naturally. And of course, the therapy didn't go well, as it often doesn't. I think it would have been really helpful for me to know that finding the right therapist is a lot like dating. Lots of deads. You have to go on a lot of first dates till you find the right one. And it went on like this for years. And sometimes I was in therapy because I had access through school. Sometimes I wasn't. Sometimes I was on meds because I had insurance, and sometimes I wasn't because they made me feel like a zombie. My coping skills were awful. Everything hurt, and I did not know how to change it. The only thing I can liken it to is feeling like a raw nerve. In 2003, I met this girl, and we had a whirlwind summer romance. But she had to go back to school in Tennessee, and we were in Florida. And so I walked away from everything that I'd ever known to be with her. And she was all I had, and I clung to her. It was the beginning of a cycle of dangerous codependence between us. I waited tables full time, and I started to have unrelenting panic attacks. That was a good time. The next couple minutes might be a little difficult for people with histories of abuse, just FYI. Our relationship became volatile, and our lives became more and more intertwined. We lived together, we worked together, went to school together, shared a bank account, had the same friends. We never left each other's sides. And one day she threatened to hit me, and another day she pushed me, and later she started to hit me in places where the bruising would be covered by my clothing. And then one day she just punched me square in the face and knocked me out and left me with a black eye. And at some point in the middle of all of that, in the middle of this progression, I started hitting back. And that made me hate myself more than almost anything else I've ever experienced, because it made me question everything about who I thought I was. And I gave ultimatum after ultimatum about how we needed to get better, how people who love each other shouldn't hurt each other. But it didn't get better, and I couldn't leave. I couldn't make myself leave. So I fell further and further into this hole. I was working full-time, going to school full-time. I lived in fear of the next argument. I was terrified she was going to leave me, and I couldn't fathom being alone. So suicidal thoughts just became an everyday occurrence at that point instead of a sometimes occurrence. I moved forward, but I often couldn't see past the day I was living. I bought a car to escape the fights, but then the car became a weapon. I started fantasizing about what I could drive into or off of, about faking an accident so no one would know that I just wanted to die. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found this amazing therapist. I think she kept me alive. I saw a psychiatrist for the first time too, and I got my second diagnosis with bipolar disorder. I got new meds to add to my old ones. And none of it lasted long though, because it was through the University Counseling Center and access was extremely limited. So that was hard. In the summer of 2006, after I graduated, I learned that my girlfriend was cheating on me, and I just unraveled. I'd been having these thoughts for a long time, and I attempted suicide again. So my girlfriend was elsewhere that night and wouldn't come home, but she did call the cops for a welfare check, and they barged into my apartment demanding to know who I was and what I'd done. And I was so terrified of being locked up that I couldn't speak. There were strangers in my house. I called my mom, and I just handed the phone to the cops, and She gave them my information. They put her back on the phone with me. She told me I had no choice. I was going to the hospital voluntarily or otherwise. And if I chose otherwise, I would be handcuffed and I would put in the police cruiser. Instead, I rode in an ambulance to the hospital and no one spoke to me. I spent a few hours alone in this cold beige hospital room. Texts were still 25 cents each because that's how long ago it was. I barely had reception, so I was left with, little more than my thoughts. And I realized that things needed to change and that I needed to stop hurting myself. That meant leaving this abusive relationship. It meant I needed to stop cutting myself. It meant finding a way out of these obsessive and relentless suicidal thoughts. And if I didn't, I probably would die. The hospital experience was really scary in the moment, but it was brief. I've heard much, much worse since then. It's really disheartening. Some of the people who need help are often humiliated and treated with resentment and forcibly restrained by people who are supposed to help us. Based on the quality of care I received that night, I feel pretty lucky that I didn't get any extra help. I'll just show you an example. This is what I walked away from my brief emergency room stay with. These are my discharge papers. So you'll see this description of depression, description of abrasions, but let me zoom in for you. So I was told to follow up in 1 day, and the number I was given is 000 000 I dare you to call that number. No one's gonna pick up. To add insult to injury, I got a $1,500 bill for that 10-minute ambulance ride a few weeks later. So it wasn't the care I got at the hospital or a therapist that got me through that experience. It was the kindness and support that I received from the people who loved me. It was my mom making sure I had a ride home from the hospital. Even though she was 6 away. It was my friend Allison leaving a party, very, very, very drunk, with a sober stranger to me who drove her to the hospital to come get me. It was my best friend sending me money saying, "Come to me, I will take care of you." And a week later, after I quit my job and packed what I could into my car, I drove 16 hours and 1,000 miles to go to her in Texas. And my best friend took care of me for the next month while I started to rebuild my life. And that's her. I moved back to Miami briefly after that. I grieved my breakup. One of my other best friends died from suicide, and I grieved that. I rarely visited my family, even though we were, in the same city. I made reckless decisions. And one of those last decisions was to move to New York with only what would fit in my car, to a room in an apartment I'd never seen with 3 roommates I'd never met. That was actually not in New York City at all, but across the Hudson River in New Jersey. And I had $1,000 to my name. That was not a good idea. I had no friends when I got to New York, but I had a camera. I was lonely, I was depressed, grieving, broke, unemployed. I had been dabbling in photography as a hobby since I lived in Tennessee, and my camera became my lifeline. I took it everywhere I went. And that's how I coped with everything that hurt. The suicidal thoughts came and went. Mostly I didn't cut myself, but sometimes I did. And I would then start over again, trying to forgive myself for the slip up. It was the only coping skill I'd had for 9 years at that point, and it worked. And by that, I mean that cutting allowed me to make emotional pain physical, and knowing it was real, being able to see it, made me feel less crazy. So breaking myself of that was a long, hard process, and I think I'm still not wholly broken of it. Sometimes those thoughts come to me. I eventually got a job at a record label licensing music videos. It's very boring. And I started to sneak my camera into concerts at night. So I, was teaching myself how to be a photographer, shooting people, photographing artists I loved. Jay-Z. The frame after that, he waved at me as the bouncers were kicking me out of the photo pit. Photographing concerts is hard. There are the rules. 3 songs no flash. People are moving, the lights are changing. You have to develop a kind of intuition, like your camera has to become an extension of you. Eventually, after doing this for long enough, my work became good enough that I started to get assignments from music blogs and media outlets, and I started doing interviews too. So I'm photographing and interviewing some of my heroes. Like, this is amazing, and I loved it so much. But after 3 years, I was like, I'm not making the contribution that I hoped I would in life. I've wanted to work in suicide since Brian died. So I studied psychology as an undergrad. I volunteered at a crisis center. I got trained in assist. And then, all of that got sidetracked by life. So then I moved on, and I was making the move to professional photography, shooting a lot of weddings. And I wanted to start a portrait project that was, more personal to me. And I went back to suicide. If anyone needs a wedding photographer, just kidding. Not kidding, but kidding. So I thought about my experiences with my suicide attempts and the years I'd spent suicidal, hurting myself, feeling scared and alone and crazy. I wondered why I didn't know anyone else with these experiences. So I pulled up Google. I didn't know what to type in, what to call myself, how to describe my experience. I typed suicide survivor and I hit enter, and this is what I found. Every hit for suicide survivor matched one facet of my experience, which was having lost people I cared for. None matched my personal experiences. And so I found myself represented in anonymous statistics. All I saw were numbers. I love this GIF. And they were numbers that may not have even been accurate, because reporting isn't always accurate, because sometimes the cause of death is ambiguous, because sometimes the cause of death isn't reported due to shame. Many suicide attempts are never reported at all, because suicide manifests differently for people with different racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, and we know very little about how it affects marginalized communities. So we're likely not catching important data, because gender is a spectrum. So that stat that says women are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than men, where do the people who don't identify on either end of the binary fall? Because when someone chooses to forego treatment and nutrition at the end of life, it's not counted. Is that suicide? I don't even know. So I think the numbers around suicide attempts and suicide deaths are a good deal larger than we think they are. But eventually I found what was called the Lifeline Gallery back then, and it was a series of nameless, disembodied voices with avatars telling bits of their stories. But what I didn't find was real people to connect to. I can't look at this anymore. So I decided I was going to find others like me, attempt survivors, and I was going to ask them to share their stories and then make their portraits. I wanted to breathe some humanity into this experience. I want to be able to feel empowered to reclaim their stories, to feel proud of them, to put their names and faces on them, and to say I survived and I'm surviving. So in 2010, that's what I did. I set out to shine a light on these people whose voices deserve to be heard. And I called it Live Through This because it's what we did and it's what we do. It took a while to find people who were willing to take a chance on this idea. I'm not going to go into detail, but I didn't make the first portrait for the project until 2011. Actually, this Labor Day weekend was the 10-year birthday of Live Through This. So it was a big weekend for me. So let's see. My process. People like to hear about process. I do. When I sit down with an attempt survivor for the project, my prompt is, tell me your name, how old you are, what you do, and your story as you see fit to tell it. So I want to make sure that, they're not telling me anything they don't want me to know or anyone else to know. I want them to be in control. I'm giving them a neutral platform to say whatever it is that they need or want to say about their experiences, what led up to their attempt, what it feels like to be suicidal, what happened after, how they survive, how they still struggle. They're in control the whole time. I want them to share only what feels safe, only what feels important. As attempt survivors, we are often put in a position where our autonomy is taken from us and where people make decisions for our own good without consulting us. And I think this leads to trauma upon trauma. So when people are with me, I want them to feel that the power is always in their hands. I listen and I hold space because many of them are telling their stories for the first time and to a stranger. All they really know about me before we meet is that I've been there, and that I'm not going to judge them. You know, for so many of us, just being able to talk about it at all, let alone safely, to someone who wants to listen is so new. You know, there's no need to feel shame. There's no need to feel judgment or worry about having the cops called. There's no being told to set it down, to let it go, to buck up, to get over it. No claims of selfishness or laziness. No recounting of all there is to live for. You know, just telling and listening, just the story. I think the last interview I did was, I guess it was last fall. But I've slowed down significantly since 2017. It was go, 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 go. And then I don't know, I started trying to get pregnant and things didn't go well, and I slowed down. But yeah, the last one I did was with a good friend of mine last year. So here's what an interview looks like.
For me, I am traditionally usually a pessimist, but I believe there's a small place in my head and my heart that hope resides. I don't feed it very often. I don't take very good care of it, I don't think. But it's always there. And even on my worst days, even in my most difficult situations, that little bit of hope to grasp onto, even if you can only hold it for a second, is essential. And I believe that most people have that. If you look hard enough, and if you focus on it, there's always one thing, one moment, one thought, one feeling, a smell, a taste, that triggers that hope. For me, I've got lots of different things that trigger hope now. My son's laugh. From the time he was very little, his laugh has saved me so many times. The smell of sea air, like when you're out on a boat. The taste of fresh fried bread, like right out of the fryer. It's still hot, you practically burn your mouth off, but that taste. All of those little things that you find pleasure in, those are your connections to hope. Don't ignore them. Don't sweep them away. Don't dismiss them even when you're at your lowest. Because that's you. That's some part of you wanting to survive. That's some part of you wanting to be there. Because if you can find pleasure in these things, then there is something that you like about your life. There is something to be here for. There's something to hold on to. And it might not be much, but sometimes all you need is a small something.
Redeemed
love her. She makes everybody cry. Her words are so beautiful. But when we're in that room, we usually talk for an hour, sometimes more. And when the survivor's done telling their story, I might ask clarifying questions, whether they have thoughts on a specific topic that came up, but it's generally pretty unstructured. I ask 2 questions to everyone, which I'll come back to later. So after that, I make the portrait. I always take them somewhere outdoors. I ask them to look into the lens. I don't tell them whether to smile or to be serious. What you see is what they were feeling on a single day in their life. I like to think of it as like a time capsule, or, you know, a reminder that they lived through a day despite their struggles. And it prompts the viewer to do something that we don't usually do, which is make eye contact. You know, we've always looked away from the suicide. Those experiencing the suicidal thoughts, those who live, those who've lost someone to suicide. And it's really important that that doesn't happen here in this project. I take people outside for a reason too. This is Nicole. Hers is the first portrait I ever made for the project. I originally set out to make these glossy studio lit portraits. And I love her portrait so much, but as I was editing it, I realized putting people on a black background might not be great. So I thought, well, maybe this is a little morbid. You know, my goal is not to shock people or to provide the world with any more sensationalistic, moody narratives of the darkness of suicide. I think, you know, this work is about life. I think suicidal despair is a part of life, a natural part of life. And, you know, that waking up and choosing to stay and struggling through is a triumph. So from that day on, I photographed almost everyone outdoors in natural light, in, you know, essentially in the world that they try to take themselves out of. So that's a secret people who hear me talk then know, because I don't write about it on the website anywhere. I don't screen people for the project. They're willing to show up and share. I'm willing to show up and listen. The only rules that I really have are the person has to be over 18. They have to be willing to use their full name and likeness. They have to be a year out from their most recent attempt. And they have to be okay with all of these things going on the internet. Because the project's home is online. You know, there are so few resources out there for us as it is, that I wanted to create something that anybody could access for free anytime. You know, accessibility is such a struggle, and it's so important. And these resources are hard to come by. So when you load up the website where the project lives, livethroughthis.org, this is what you see when you type in the URL. You're presented with this giant grid of people who are different in so many ways, but who are all connected by their experiences with suicide, what happened after being a part of this project. It's the only project in existence where these stories are displayed in such large volume, in such depth, and not a single one of them is anonymous. So back to me. In 2012, after being one of the first gay people in New York City to get married, I enjoyed the recognition of being one of the first gay people in New York to get divorced also. It seems funny, but that was hard. I mean, it's a divorce. It made me suicidal. And it was a very lonely experience. I didn't know anybody else who was gay who had been divorced, and I didn't know how to handle it. I was suicidal again a year after, in 2013, when Cosmo approached me to write about it. And all that writing meant reliving. My girlfriend, now my wife, Belle, she encouraged me to find help. And she came with me to see my new therapist, which no one had ever done for me. I was diagnosed with anxiety then, so I decided to try meds again. Such a process over the years. That same year, I put together this Kickstarter project, this Kickstarter campaign. I wanted to take the project out of New York, onto the road, meet as many different kinds of people as possible, and really collect different stories. In 30 days, I raised $23,000, and 600 people thought this was a worthwhile endeavor, and that was just shocking to me. I'm very happy for it. It was an overwhelming amount of support, and I think that speaks to the importance of these stories. It's still the case that the project runs on funds from supporters. That's not saying a ton, but I can mostly pay for the website for monthly donations and t-shirts and pins. But I like it that way. in 2015, Belle and I got married. We went on this epic honeymoon. I won an award for my work. Belle got offered a job as a professor in Philadelphia, and we left New York City. Also, because this is very important, we got a puppy. Her name is Dolly Parton. She's on the left, and that's Canelita on the right. I didn't want her to feel left out. That same year, my grandfather had a health scare. Remember I talked about him earlier. He had a health scare that sent my family into a scramble, and there was nothing I could do to fix any of it. And I found myself back in a familiar place, suicidal and hurting myself. And there's a scene in the S Word, if you've seen it, where I'm crying and I talk about hurting myself, and it was at that time. So more secrets. It was around then that my therapist told me that the bipolar diagnosis that I'd had for a decade was wrong. And so I was just anxious and depressed, and that was that. And all of those terrible things that I'd internalized about being bipolar were just supposed to disappear, I guess. So 2 years later, when Fel and I started planning for the babies, we planned for the possibility that I would probably get postpartum depression. We planned really intensely around that possibility. What we didn't plan for was the depression that I experienced during pregnancy for some reason. I was so sick and in so much pain the whole 9 months. And I put my body and my mind through so much to get pregnant. 4 inseminations, 5 IVF cycles, a miscarriage, and all the emotional stuff that comes along with hoping and wishing and building stories around this potential person every time you try. And that was hard. And so when I finally did get pregnant, the depression set in around 4 months in, and I just felt so trapped in my body, and I started to have the suicidal thoughts again. But these were the worst that I had ever experienced, because there was no way out for me. It wasn't an option while I was growing this tiny human. And I never did get PPD, but I did get the baby, so that's good. I'm weaving my life and back into the work too, because they're so intertwined, and this work is so deeply personal to me. Suicidal thoughts are a part of me, and I've shown you all the ways in which they've manifested for me, sometimes linked to a diagnosis picked in a book, and oftentimes not at all. As it turns out, one of the things that's been behind almost all of my suicidal crises, I think, is the mental health system itself. Another piece fell into place recently, ADD. Things I've struggled with my whole life: an inability to focus, an inability to organize my thoughts and my things, forgetting to eat because figuring out what to eat is overwhelming, extreme emotions, bad self-esteem. I had no idea, and figured that out. And I happened to be taking a DSM class this semester, and I flipped through to the section on bipolar disorder. I think that's where this is. And I learned that ADD is often misdiagnosed as bipolar too. To say that I'm furious would be an epic understatement. I tried to rewrite this paragraph like 5 times, and I just quit. I'm too mad to sum up the meaning of this new development in a couple of sentences. So all this to say that what I'm going through mirrors what so many of the people who have shared for the project are going through, but the only story I can tell is my own, and the rest are on the website for you to look at. So far, I have interviewed and photographed 189 attempt survivors in 36 different cities, from Florida to Alaska, lots in between. And this is a demographic breakdown of the people currently on the site. So I don't explicitly collect demographics. This is based off of what's reported by the person, or what's observable, or what I know about them, because I keep in touch with so many of them. The age range, 19 to 69. When I first started the project, it was almost completely white people who identified as women, cisgender women. But the longer I've gone on, the more I've kind of gotten closer to I guess, national averages of representation. So we see that I've got about 24% identify as people of color, about a quarter are identify as queer. some gender identity differences. There are some trans and non-binary people. There are several faiths represented. Just so many incredible people are in this project. I feel really weird breaking them down into tables. Also, 17.5% of the attempt survivors I interviewed also identify as lost survivors, which I think is something that we lose a lot. A lot of people who are attempt survivors have also experienced suicide loss. So, major themes. I'm so thirsty. Major themes that come up in the stories. Suicidal thoughts recur for a lot of us. Like I said, I asked two questions during my interviews, and one of them is suicide still an option for you? What I noticed when I was doing my research initially was that of the few stories available, they kind of all followed almost like a formula. It was like, bad thing happened, suicide attempt, therapy and meds, better forever. And they were all anonymous too, so that's part of the reason why it felt so important to really include human beings here. But that wasn't true to my experience. I told you I've experienced suicidal thoughts all my life, and I just didn't think that I was alone in that. So the question that I ask people, because I think that we're sold a story that is not true and that can be harmful. So essentially, I'm gathering proof. The answer that almost everyone has is some version of, yes, it's an option, but I don't want it to be. And then they explain what that means to them. I think that's more of an honest picture of the experience. It comes in waves or cycles, like grief, like joy, like life. And ideally, we find our ways to cope and keep surviving. I'm going to skip this, but it's a cool quote that says suicidality exists on a continuum. And we're probably all fairly suicidal at some point in our lives. I think it speaks to the idea that these thoughts can persist over time. They can wax and wane. And that they range in severity. I think that's also really important to know. The other question that I ask people is, what good things have come from your experiences with suicide? We tend to talk only about the negative aspects of it. And I wanted to know more about the other side of that. I have one more video and I hope that it'll work. So we're going to try. Here's how Ashley Lofton answered that question. Hope we can hear it. And if it does work, there are loud sirens in the middle. I don't know how to edit those out. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that there have been a lot of benefits. There have been a lot, and namely, it's had to do with other people. It's had to do with knowing what to do in situations that other people don't know what to do. And I have an anecdote. Do you want to hear my anecdote? Yeah. My anecdote is when I believe I was a senior in college. My roommate and I went into a Taco Bell, and there was a girl sitting in the booth, all these people crowded around her, breathing fast, shaking, thinks she's having a heart attack, and she's like my age. Not that it's not possible, but I'm looking at it, and I'm like, all right, I am in the line with my roommate, I keep looking back, and I see all these people crowding around her, and I'm like, I think I know what's happening, I think I can help. And I keep looking back, and finally my roommate is like, if you think you can help, go over there, I walk over there, and this is not something I usually do because I'm not a big people person so much. Like, I like talking one-on-one, but there was a crowd of people over there. I went over there, and I just suddenly felt very in control of the situation. And I was like, do any of you know her? No one knew her. So I was like, okay, back away. Like, stand back there. Let her breathe, get away from her, and I sat across from her, and I took both of her hands in mine, and I asked her what her name was, and she told me, and it was Hannah, which I remember. And I was like, Hannah, I'm Ashley. And then I started describing her symptoms to her, and she kept nodding and nodding. And I was like, okay. Like, I wasn't a medical expert, but I was like, I believe that you're having a panic attack. And her friend was outside calling an ambulance, so if it wasn't that, I felt like okay to tell her this. I was like, I believe that you're having a panic attack. So I'm going to sit here, and you're going to breathe with me. And I sat and I breathed in really deeply and out really deeply, and I spoke to her very softly. And once I felt like I could feel her heart in her hands, I felt like her heart rate was down. I asked her, okay, what's going on, you know? And she was afraid she was going to lose her job. If something had happened and she was afraid she was going to lose her job. So I just sat and I talked to her, and 15 minutes go by, and by the end of it, she's laughing with me, and her friend comes in, the ambulance had pulled up, and she's laughing with me, and I don't know, like, it was just this moment, like, of clarity. I felt, like, very emotional afterward, because it was this moment of clarity, like, all of this makes so much sense right now. Like, all of the stuff that I've been through before makes so much sense, because I mean, I'm sure she would have been fine if I hadn't been there, but what were the odds that I walked in there at that exact moment and that I could do that? And no one else knew what was going on, and they were crowding around her, and they were doing all of the things that I know that I would have hated, you know? And it was, I don't know, it was just one of those moments that I felt like it all made so much sense. And I was grateful that I had had the experiences that I had had.
Redeemed.
So the answers, everyone's answers are very much like Ashley's. That I now know how to help people. They allow me to better understand people and to help them. And I love that. I think it's so important, and it clues us into something that we've been ignoring, which is that no one knows a survivor's struggles better than another survivor. You know, peer support is incredibly powerful. So impact. When I redesigned the site in 2017, I built in a pop-up survey because I wanted to see who was using the site and how. And in 2018, we had like 600 people participate, and we analyzed the data in January of 2019. So it's a little old, but I think it gives us a sense of things. Lots of people with lived experience in coming to the website. 84% had experienced suicidal thoughts of their own, and almost half of them were attempt survivors. People visited the site who had loved ones who were impacted. 36% had a loved one with suicidal thoughts, and 27% had a loved one with a suicide attempt, and a quarter are lost survivors. You know, it's a lot. Suicide continues to devastate our society, and these people with lived experience and of suicidality, we need to be at every table related to suicidology and suicide prevention. We are what has been missing from this work. And I think we're integral to it. So let's use my work with Live Through This as an example of what it could look like to bring people to the table. So I got to hang out with this guy one time. That was weird. I've worked with suicidologists on crafting media reporting guidelines. I've consulted on apps that use AI to train providers on how to work with people with lived experience. I consulted on character development for the Broadway play Dear Evan Hansen. I've been able to share my work in the New York Times, on the Glenn Beck program, on CNN, on CBS. We talked about this earlier very briefly. I do this very strange podcast that I produce and co-host with One of my best friends called Suicide and Stuff, as you can tell by the graphics, which were all my idea, also the color palette. It is meant to be irreverent, informal, playful. I'm always trying to get people to be more comfortable talking about suicide. And, you know, we approach topics through a critical suicidology lens. We're also talking about our lives, we're laughing on a suicide podcast. We've covered all sorts of things in our first year, from anti-fatness and suicide, incarceration, film, the supernatural, lots of research, to how problematic Suicide Prevention Month can be. You guys can find my rants on Twitter about that. Live Through This is used as a tool. Therapists are sharing it with their clients. I regularly collaborate with researchers now. We are using the narratives to ask questions about PTSD, experiences with mental health care, gender and sexual minority identities intersecting with lived experience identities. I think it's so important that we're involved in the research process, so we're able to guide the questions and course correct if necessary. I also frequently recruit for researchers. I also think it's important that Live Through This is taught to crisis workers and future clinicians. One thing I think most lay people don't know is that we're not trained for this. Most of the people, when you're going to a therapist, they usually they're not ready for you. It is shocking to me that one of our main messages in suicide prevention is to urge people to reach out for help, and there aren't enough people there to catch us. So it's really fulfilling to see that this work is playing a role in changing that. I wrote this policy brief recently on the need for suicide-related training in graduate programs. You probably can't read it, I don't know. But if anyone wants to look at the PDF later, I will happily send it. The CDC came out with a report 2 years ago that showed that 54% of Americans who died by suicide over a 17-year period did not have a known mental health history. That is such a huge piece of information so many people are ignoring. There are lots of ways to be critical about it, but it points to the complexity of the problem. There's an intersection with mental health differences, but there are so many other issues at play. Look at all of this: relationship problems, substance use, job problems, loss of housing, all sorts of things, life things. And so this is what fuels me. You know, we have to think about this differently. Tying it solely to mental illness in a biomedical model is just limiting its scope. I think it's has a much, much bigger impact than we know. So we've got to think differently. Now I'm gonna start like speed reading my script because I'm over. As it stands, we have a PR problem in suicidology and suicide prevention. We are in conflict with ourselves, which makes it really difficult to land on a shared goal. And it makes it really difficult to get people on board who haven't already been affected by suicide. We'll tell you that it's the 10th leading cause of death in the US. It's the 2nd leading cause of death among young people. A statement like this might lead the casual observer to think that this is an important thing that we should be paying attention to. But then we, as the suicidologists, the suicide prevention professionals, will push you away by telling you that it's a rare event, that it's abnormal. We'll tell you that it's linked to depression and mental illness, and then we'll show you a picture like this. And these pictures are probably why so many people say that they had no idea that a person that they knew was suicidal. I would bet money on that. I don't bet them. This is what we think of when we think of suicide. Not all the beautiful faces that I've shown you tonight. Not all the faces of all the survivors we've never met or the ones who haven't been able to share yet. We're not thinking about those people. This is what we're thinking of. We'll tell you that it's a complex phenomenon, and then we'll follow it up talking about assessments and screenings and risk factors and evidence-based practices that are normed on white people, and then totally ignore the realities of the world that we're living in. If suicide is so complex, there have to be many ways of knowing about it. There have to be many kinds of responses to it. Our body of knowledge around suicide is not as established as we would have people believe, as we want to believe. The research is not as rigorous as it should be, nor has it historically been influenced by or inclusive of the people who are directly affected. Of course, we want answers we can rely on. I totally understand that, but we don't have them yet. So my challenge today is that we broaden our views on suicide. to remember the path. My challenge is to remember the path that we're on now is not the only way of knowing. You know, how does the view change when we start asking questions and making links? How does the view change when we start asking about ableism, colonization, white supremacy, structural oppression, forced treatment, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia? How do those things impact suicide? How does the view change when we acknowledge that suicide and mental illness are deeply political topics? They carry a long history of abuses. What about when we start linking it to Nazi experiments and forced sterilization? And when we start thinking about mental illness and suicide in the carceral system, when we start talking about the ethics of pulling people out of their environments, handcuffing them and taking them to a hospital against their will. Suicide does not happen in the vacuum that we think, or that we've acted like it does. We've got to stop locating it as this disorder within a person and look outward. We have to look at people in the context of our environments. Like this current climate that we're all dealing with, fires for y'all, a pandemic, the political climate, rife for suicide. We have to take, you know, people's unique histories, cultures, belief systems, every single thing about them into account when we are deciding how best to offer support. I knew that someday we would lose someone in the Live Through This family. It's just a reality of this work. And I think the longer that I worked with attempt survivors, the more likely it was going to happen. So Natalie Medina was the first person we lost in the Live Through This family. She died in the summer of 2016. And I interviewed her in 2014, and I just fell in love with her. Loved her so much. And I thought prior to that when the day came that we lost somebody, I would have to stop doing this. But Natalie made sure that I knew these stories needed to be shared. So the opposite happened. After her death, I felt more resolve than ever to make sure that our voices are heard. This part is hard for me. In 2018, we lost Bob. And a few months later in 2018, we lost Heidi. Heidi was local to Philadelphia. And then last summer, we lost Stella. Stella's son, Christopher, died by suicide in 2010 too. And her other son, John, is also an attempt survivor who I photographed for the project. Every single one of these people I just showed you survived great trauma. Their stories are incredible, and they did what they were supposed to. They did what we told them. And still, the world was too harsh and their pain was too great. Every day that they stayed was a triumph. And the fact that we lost them, to me, points to a failure in the system. When Stella told her story, she said, I don't think humans are supposed to have that much struggle. I don't know if it's genetic, if it's nature or nurture, but I've been around long enough to know that enough of us do. And with the exponential increase in the incidence in suicide, especially with our young people in this nation, it abhors me that so little is being done about it. And she is right. What we've been doing is not working, and it's not enough. And so I've been thinking about ways that people can help that aren't the same old thing. So here's a rapid fire list. I'm gonna try and read through it really quick. Be willing to have the conversation. That's the first and biggest thing. Know that every suicidal thought isn't a crisis, that some suicidal thoughts are comforting for people, that some suicidal thoughts are harm reduction, that sometimes having that one option of suicide is what keeps people alive. I know that seems counterintuitive, but I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that. You have to be ready to ask the question, to listen, to take time and explore, and don't run away in fear or call someone else. Validate that pain, sit with it, hold it. It is deeply uncomfortable. Acknowledge that the world is not set up for a lot of us to exist, let alone to survive or thrive. Whether you're supporting someone in crisis as a family member or a friend, or you're serving them as a care worker, always remember that their agency, their self-determination should be your primary focus. How do you get them through a crisis while allowing them to retain control over themselves and maintaining safety as they define it? Reserve 911 for a last resort. There was a slide about that earlier, so I'm going to skip this part. I have lots of feelings about that. Put lived experience at the forefront whenever and wherever you can. Partner with us, like I showed you. Collaborate with us. Legitimize peer support as valid and valuable, and pay people well for that expertise. Legitimize being a clinician or an academic with lived experience. Legitimize being open about that lived experience, and reject all that gross, harmful prejudice in the field, because it is hurting us. It is hurting us. Let us tell our stories. Let us tell them how we want to. Don't force us into the good survivor narrative. Let us see others like us, and how differently we struggle and how it's not always pretty. Let us redefine hope ourselves through the knowledge that the struggle of suicidal thoughts and actions is valid and real, and that it's not selfish or weak, and that it might happen again and again, but with the right supports, we can get through it. Learn about mental health and voluntary commitment laws. I'm doing this right now, and oh my God. Learn about how all of that affects our civil liberties. Learn how you can advocate for someone who's been involuntarily committed and who has few supports. Understand that all of this affects Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, and queer people completely differently than it would someone who presents as straight and white. Think critically about the messaging that we're presented with around suicide prevention, and demand better. Fight for funding, for policy change, better research. Validate, accept, appreciate, and celebrate the Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color in your life. Validate, accept, appreciate, and celebrate the fat and disabled people in your life. Believe victims. That's suicide prevention. Donate to people with lived experience. Are they doing work you love? Donate to it. Are they struggling with bills? Pay one. Do you know any trans people? Use their preferred names and their pronouns. We have statistics that say that using the preferred pronouns of someone, not like preferred pronouns, using their pronouns saves their lives. Like, it saves lives. Something so simple. Donate to their legal name change and gender marker change funds. Donate to their surgery funds. Throw them parties. Celebrate them and love them. If you know someone in the middle of a breakup, support them. Like, listen, even if you're tired of it, grab them dinner. Be a safe adult for our kids. This one is really important to me. I've had so few safe adults in my life as a teenager, and kids deserve our love and our care and our guidance, even if they're not our own kids. Use your skills to make someone's life better. Anything you have. Suicide prevention is all of these things. It's not just the obvious things. It's subtle and it's explicit. It is having food, housing, living wage, health care, supporting people who need help with sliding scale therapy fees, legal fees, paying bail funds, abolishing bail. It's acknowledging structural oppression, white supremacy, and doing something about it. It's fighting for disability rights, for civil rights, for reproductive rights, for voting rights, especially right now, the voting rights. It is literally nothing more than taking care of one another. It is community, it's collective care, it's mutual support. And when you're improving a person's quality of life, any one person, you are practicing suicide prevention. This is up to us, so we have to get to work. Thanks, y'all.